In this section, we're going to talk about industry and transportation. Our essential question is, how did transportation developments and industrialization affect the nation's economy? This whole unit is about American nationalism, how the nationalism inspired after the War of 1812 helped our nation grow into the country that it is today. You'll recall during the period where we were not trading with Great Britain, we began to develop our own industry so we could create our own products. We're going to talk about the development of that industry in this section. So first of all, how did people used to travel overland in the 1800s? They took carts and wagons and coaches, usually pulled by horses. They were usually traveling on dirt roads. All of these methods were super slow and also expensive. Like, this whole get-up was not available to the average person. So one of our nation's first priorities when working on internal improvements was to improve roads. Some states use turnpikes or toll roads where you pay to use it. The money was supposed to improve the roadways. However, only a few of those roads were profitable. There was the development of one national road called the Cumberland Road that extended from Maryland all the way to the Ohio River. It was the first major highway built by the federal government under the American system, which provided funds for those internal improvements. Today, the road is designated as a historic highway and follows the route of US 40 through those same states. Canals were another feature of travel in early American history. Most of these canals were constructed in the Northeast and provided for efficient water transportation in absence of natural rivers. So the Erie Canal was the most famous and most used canal. It ran from Lake Erie over here in western New York all the way to the Hudson River. This helped to make New York City, at the end of the Hudson River, a major commerce center, because all of the goods that were produced throughout the state of New York and over here in these areas could be transported to New York City to be sold. The steamboat was important for traveling on these canals and rivers. It was invented by Robert Fulton, and his Claremont was the first steamboat. It was important for traveling because it was easier to travel up current. Steamboats were powered by steam, burning coal, which made them not exactly safe. There were many steamboat accidents in our early history that unfortunately caused a loss of life. However, this allowed us to move much faster and move goods much faster, which means that we are selling and producing more, thus growing our economy and our industry. The impact that the steamboat had on transportation, a trip that took 4 months before the steamboat took just 20 days by 1820, and then just 6 days by 1838. So we can see here the Northeast, where most of the canals were made. There's our Erie Canal. But you can see that there were numerous that connected the Great Lakes to, like, the Ohio River, which allowed us to transport it to sell. Railroads were primarily developed in Great Britain in the 1820s. They did not become a major fixture in the United States until a couple of decades later. The mid-1800s was when we really started focusing on railroad building. Railroads were important because they cost less to build than canals, and also the trains were faster than ships. So, overall, just a better method of transportation. So, we know that we don't use canals that often here in the United States, but railroads are a major fixture on our landscape. The impact that railroads had on transportation, a journey that took 28 days by boat, took only 2 days by train by 1857. So here we see roads that were built prior to 1850 are in black. There's a few, all right, but roads built in the decade of 1850 to 1860, many, many more. And you can see that a lot of that railroad was built in the North, which is going to be incredibly important once we get to the Civil War. So new developments in technology did spark economic growth by transforming the way that we manufactured goods. In the early 1800s, the United States experienced its first industrial revolution. Many of you know from world history that this first happened in Great Britain. It didn't take long for that technology to come to us. So the Industrial Revolution is all about the switch to using machines as the main mode of transportation, which resulted in a rapid change in the economy. The Industrial Revolution is responsible for changing the economy, culture, and politics of the United States. Textile mills were the first centers of industry in the United States. Samuel Slater opened the first textile mill in the United States in the 1790s. Many of these were built in the Northeast because of the swiftly flowing rivers of New England. These textile mills were water powered. We can see here this wheel that turns. Many of you have probably seen them before, and that is how they provided power to run the machines at these mills. The Lowell Mills in Massachusetts was really the first industrial system in the United States, developed by a man named Francis Cabot Lowell. So what he did was establish a new town that was centered around the mills. He created housing for the people who worked there and employed young single women who were looking for opportunities to make money, to gain some independence away from their family. However, because of the strict morals of the time, the Lowell girls were forced to live in closely supervised boarding houses to make sure that no one was getting into any funny business. But this was a new model of industry where we basically see our first company town, where everyone lives in the housing, everybody works at this one factory, providing for a really efficient system. So here we can see Lowell, Massachusetts. With the introduction of factory work, the working lives of Americans changed. Most Americans had been and with factories, we see people begin to be employed in mass numbers, all working on machines, which allow employers to hire unskilled workers at lower wages. So the need for people who are trained in a specific career declines because we develop a system where anybody can push a button or pull a lever, can work the machine, and therefore they're not required to be paid as much. An important part of developing these factories and manufacturing are interchangeable parts. So interchangeable parts are identical components that can be used in place of one another. This is something that we kind of take for granted, right? If something breaks, we can go buy a replacement at the store. Something in our car messes up, we can fix it. Back in the old days, when things were handcrafted by individuals, if something broke, you had to replace the entire machine or entire product. Interchangeable parts is what allows us to build things in factories and then also have the convenience of replacing just small parts instead of the whole good. Interchangeable parts were introduced in the United States by Eli Whitney and allowed us to industrialize and move to factory work. So here we're going to talk about several inventions that took place during this time. You have a chart in your notes to record those. The telegraph was introduced in 1837 by Samuel F.B. Morse. You may say, Morse, that's familiar. Yes, Morse code, which is used to communicate on the telegraph. This improved communication. This is the first time that messages could be delivered instantaneously, something that we're obviously very used to. The telegraph was used throughout the 1800s until it was eventually replaced by the telephone. But this was the first way that we could get a message to someone just like that instead of having to send a letter and send it over mail or by boat, which took days, if not weeks or months. We also saw the invention of the sewing machine in 1845 by Elias Howe and Isaac Singer. Many of you have probably seen an old sewing machine like this, maybe in your house or at your grandparents' house. The sewing machine lowered the cost and improved the speed of turning cloth into clothing. And this is what textile mills were all about, turning items like cotton into cloth and then being able to turn that cloth into clothing. The steel plow was developed by John Deere, a name that I'm sure we all are familiar with. The steel plow was incredibly important for Americans moving west because it was better at breaking the soil in the Midwest and made farming more productive. The soil in the Midwest tended to be like rockier and harder to, plow. So the steel plow enabled farmers to make that soil productive. John Deere is remembered as the inventor of the plow that broke the plains. The mechanical reaper also had to do with farming, just the other side of farming. The plow allowed us to plant. The reaper allows us to harvest. The mechanical reaper was introduced in 1831 by Cyrus McCormick, and it made it quicker and easier to gather crops. We can see it here being pulled by a horse. Eventually it would be, powered by an engine, which made it even faster and more productive. But instead of having to harvest these crops by hand, we now have a machine that can do it much easier and faster. Vulcanized rubber was introduced in the United States in 1839 by Charles Goodyear. Yes, the same Goodyear that produces the tires. It makes rubber easier to use. It won't melt at higher temperatures, which is obviously incredibly important for us who drive cars, right? Imagine how hot your tires get going 70 miles per hour. Rubber in its natural form is very brittle and not like the rubber that powers so many of our machines. And finally, the cotton gin, introduced in 1794 by Eli Whitney. The cotton gin allows the seeds to be removed from cotton crops much easier. We went from being able to produce like 1 pound of cotton it took the same amount of time to produce 50 pounds as it did to produce 1 pound of cotton, just because of getting those seeds out so quickly. The cotton gin is actually responsible for strengthening slavery in the South. Once we're able to produce cotton much faster, there is a greater need for that labor in the South. So while our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, thought that slavery would eventually die out on its own, the cotton gin helped make sure that that fixture of our economy in the South would remain in place.